established rich coming right back at you. I need everybody to slow down for a second. This is not about hating on a young artist. This is about understanding history. Lil Yachty went on the platform and called Rapper's Delight weak. Not just dated, weak. And that's where his whole problem starts. Because when you call a foundational record weak, you're not critiquing production. You critiquing context. And context is everything.
Yeah. Yo, you came out of this SoundCloud era that is it's historically important because we got so many incredible artists, but also there was so much crazy bullshit that kind of came out of that era as well.
But every era, you know, so funny. I remember when I went to do my research on just like the music that came before me. It was a lot of bullshit that came out of the 90s.
That's fair.
A lot of bullshit that came out in the fucking 80s and early 2000s, but they act like only the 2016 and up.
I just think it was a little more. I think it was a little more. It was a little more elevated.
Sure,
the amounts of bullshit,
but not all of it.
No, you're right.
There's some stuff out there but it's so crazy. I remember in 2016, before I did my research, I didn't know this. If it was 2016 and I knew it was so much bullshit in the 90s, I'd be like, yo, y'all fucking tripping. You know what I'm saying? It was a lot of weak ass shit going on out there. And just to be, as a matter of fact, actually, you know what's so crazy to me? I think about all the time, I always think about the first song in hip hop. I hope this don't fry me. He probably will. And I always think about a hip, a hop, a hip.
Rapper's Delight.
Top and the boom. Take a bang. You know what I'm saying? And I'll be thinking like, damn, bro, y'all be really acting like we just just couldn't. Like we was the only niggas saying some shit that didn't make no sense.
Now, here's what matters. You cannot listen to 1979 with 2026 ears and think you being intelligent. That's like watching the first color television and saying, damn, the pitch ain't even HD. Of course it's not HD. It's the road to HD. Rapper's Delight wasn't supposed to sound like 2016 SoundCloud music. It wasn't supposed to sound like auto-tune rap. It was a door. And doors are not judged by how pretty they are. Doors are judged by what they open. This is the mistake Lil Yachty is making. He's judging invention by evolution. You don't compare Wilt Chamberlain to Victor Wembanyama and then call Wilt weak because he ain't shoot jump back threes. You look at Wilt and you say, without him, the game don't advance. Same thing here. You don't listen to the Sugar Hill Gang and expect internal rhyme schemes like Rakim. Rakim didn't exist yet. You don't expect Scarface's depth. That evolution came later. You don't expect LL Cool J's charisma or Snoop Dogg's cadence. They built on a foundation. And that foundation was simple because it was new. This is why historical literacy matters. You can't just listen to old records. You gotta study the times they were made in. What was going on in 1979? Disco dominance. Radio locked out rap. No streaming, no DSPs, no sample clearance infrastructure, no template. They were inventing format, inventing structure, inventing how rap lives outside of the part. And you calling it weak because it sounds different from a world that created it. That's not critique, that's ignorance. And here's the part that makes this sound even more ridiculous. If you comparing yourself to 1979 rap, what does that say about your confidence? Why ain't you comparing yourself to Rakim, to Big Daddy Kane, to Cool G Rap, to Scarface, to Nas? Why is your target the infancy of the genre? Because it's easier. It's a low bar. And that's what it starts to feel like attention seeking. Not because he has an opinion. Every era questions the last, but because he's questioning the birth certificate. That's different. If you don't understand why Rapper's Delight matters, you don't belong in hip hop. You listening, but you ain't studying. Now, let's deal with the argument that every era had BS music, because that's his defense. Yachty says it ain't just his generation. The 80s and the 90s had trash rappers too. He says old heads only focus on 2016 to 2018. Like that was the only era with mediocre records. And on the surface, he ain't wrong. Every era had filler. Every era had gimmicks. Every era had records that didn't age well. But here's the difference. The 80s and 90s were not built on filler. They were built on foundation. The SoundCloud era was criticized because it was new. It was criticized because it shifted priority from lyricism to vibe. And that's not a crime. But don't pretend the pushback was just random. When hip-hop spent years centered on wordplay, and then all of a sudden it started revolving around the hook. Of course there was a resistance. That's natural. But here's the thing Yachty misses. When you critique the past, you have to acknowledge that the past created your luxury of experimentation. You can mumble because somebody structured flow first. You can vibe because somebody else established the rhythm first. You can ignore bar structure because somebody perfected it first. This is why context matters.
And niggas was hipping and hopping in. And I'm like, come on, bro, that shit was weak as hell, bro. Like, niggas be acting like, no, bro, come on. Yeah, I do unshoe my brother to the store, and I went in the grocery store with it. Come on, bro. Yeah, acting like that shit wasn't weak. That shit was dumb weak, bro. But niggas be acting like we was the only ones that made some crazy shit. I think
Right.
I agree with you. I do think that there was more intention, probably, right? You had a DMX, and you had a Busta Rhymes, and you had a Tupac, and you had all these
Tribe Called Quest,
yeah, all these,
Nas,
yeah,
and-
of course,
X
and
was
you know,
the
yes,
greatest
all you had all these Prodigy
was.
and
I seen X a lot.
Mobb Deep. So you did have. There was a lot more. You know what I will say? I think that hip hop lost its. Like it's what's the word for like just like the way there was division. Like if you was from the West, you sounded like it. If you was from the North, you sounded like it.
Yeah, I think the region.
Now listen carefully to the energy. It's not defensive. It sounds like a man who feels misunderstood. And that's where this gets interesting. Some critics are saying this is frustration. Frustration at not being respected as a lyricist. Frustration at not being placed in the technical conversation. And instead of aiming up, he aimed backward, which is a strategic error. If you want respect, you don't diminish the roots. You expand the tree. You don't call the foundation weak. You build something stronger on top of it. Because when you say rappers' delight is weak, you're not just critiquing cadence. You critiquing the moment hip-hop stepped into the world market. You critiquing the commercial that opened the door. And that's a heavy statement. Now this is where we have to slow it all the way down because it's not just about Lil Yachty. It's about how we study music. You cannot just press play on an old record and think you did your homework. That is not studying. That's listening. And listening without context is the fastest way to sound misinformed. When you go back to 1979, you're not just listening to a song. You are listening to a moment. You are listening to a culture trying to figure out how it exists on wax. There was no blueprint, no MTV, no Grammys, no Billboard rap category, no major label handbook. Rappers' Delight wasn't competing with rap records. It was competing with disco. It was competing with rock. It was competing with the whole music industry. It was competing with a music industry that didn't believe rap would last 5 years. So when you hear that delivery, when you hear that cadence, you hearing the first attempt at putting a block party into a corporate system. That is historical. And history is not judged by modern mixing standards. You don't listen to early Beatles multi-track recordings and say, this is me. You understand they were inventing the process. You don't watch early NBA footage and say, damn, they can't shoot like today. You understand, the game evolved. This is where Yachty sounds ridiculous. Not because he has an opinion, but because he's applying modern expectations to an infancy stage of hip hop. That's like criticizing the first cell phone for not having Face ID. You missing the point entirely. And here's the part that makes it even more unnecessary. If you want to challenge history, challenge prime history. Don't compare yourself to 1979. Compare yourself to Rakim. Compare yourself to Big Daddy Kane. Compare yourself to Cool G Rap. Compare yourself to LL Cool J. If you believe you that nice, then aim higher. Because when you aim at the game's baby pictures, it feel like you trying to pick an easy target. Not because people hate new artists, but because hip-hop requires reverence for context. You can evolve the sound. You can bend the rules. You can create a new era. But you don't dismiss the first era just because it sounds different than your playlist. That ain't bold. That's shallow. This whole conversation is a reminder that you cannot understand hip-hop without understanding time. Songs speak to the moment they were born in. If you don't study the conditions, the economics, the technology, the cultural tension, you will never understand why certain records hit the way they did. But hey, that's just my opinion. What's yours? Like, comment, subscribe, establish Rich. I'll be back with another one. Peace.